Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's TOC podcast. I'm Joe Weichert, co-chair of O'Reilly's Tools of Change conference. Before we jump into today's interview, I wanted to mention a couple of important items. First, if you haven't already done so, I highly recommend you check out Todd Satterston's project, Every Book is a Startup. It's an interesting publishing experiment that should appeal to the entire TOC community. You can find it by searching for Every Book is a Startup on O'Reilly.com. Also, please be sure to visit the official TOC conference website, toccon.com, where we announce all our upcoming podcasts, webcasts, and other TOC events. For today's podcast, I'm joined by Terry Jones, CEO of Fluidinfo. As they note on their website, Fluidinfo is often described as Wikipedia for data. They enable metadata searching through the use of APIs, which we'll talk more about in a moment. Terry, welcome to this TOC podcast.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, Terry, for those in the TOC crowd who aren't familiar with APIs, can you give us a quick overview of what they're for and how they benefit a company who creates them?
Yeah, the way I like to think about APIs and sort of to make an analogy so that people can understand what they are is if you think about user interfaces, they allow people to access information and to work with information, through graphical user interfaces and so on. You push a button, a certain thing happens, you see a certain piece of information and so on. So user interfaces are for people to get to information, and APIs are the same thing, but it's just for programs to get to information. So if a programmer wants to write a certain application and it wants to display something on the screen like a price, then the program uses the API to say, give me the price on that book. And it's kind of like the user clicking around on the user interface where they say, click here to see the price, and the price is displayed. So user interfaces and APIs are kind of the same thing. One's for humans and one is for programs. I think that's probably the best and the simplest way to start to understand what APIs are. In answer to the second part of the question, what are they useful for? They're good for companies because companies try to get to their audiences in different ways and to put their products onto the web, let's say, using HTML. So a lot of people use a web browser to find out information about companies' products, but that's kind of one size fits all. And everyone who goes to the website has basically the same kind of experience with some modifications that are, there might be some customizations or personalizations. But companies recognize that there are many possible ways that their products might be consumed, might be presented to people, might be found, and so on. And in order to sort of act on that potentiality, they can make an API which makes it possible for programmers to build other applications which weren't anticipated by the company that allow the company's product data to be extracted by applications and presented in different ways. And so it's basically an acknowledgement by a company that they don't understand or they can't anticipate or it's not economic for them to build many, many different user interfaces to their products. And so by having an API, they're allowing for that possibility to happen, in the hands of the programming community. So there's kind of two approaches. There's HTML is one size fits all. The company's in charge of it, look and feel and all that sort of stuff. The API is like, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let programmers do what they want. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the thing I like most about this is just the open-ended nature of it. And, O'Reilly recently conducted that API competition with your Fluidinfo platform. And one of the things I truly loved about that experiment was that it led to solutions that we, the publisher, had never even considered. And, we talked about how we need to look at our content and API access as providing kind of like a Lego service for developers so they can assemble the individual pieces in whatever fashion makes sense. Is that a good way for publishers to view the API opportunity?
I think so, yeah. In fact, I love that analogy that you made when we had the competition about Lego, because it's such a familiar thing, and the creativity of kids playing around with Lego and the stuff that they do and so on is very often very, very surprising and great and ingenious and stuff that you couldn't have anticipated and so on. So I think it is a good way for publishers to think about their content or an alternate form of their content. And it's not necessarily one that they're fully in control of. It's not something that they may have anticipated. It may be threatening in some cases. It may be liberating or more valuable in other cases. but you're really opening up a world of possibilities by having an API. You don't know exactly what's going to happen, but that's kind of the point.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you a question a little bit here about the sort of pros and cons in that. But before we get to that, a phrase that you used in an earlier conversation that we had, which I love, is that read-only is not the future. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that statement?
Yeah, I can. I can talk for hours about that. Sort of at a high level, if you look at the way that normal people work with information in the world, a lot of times we make the world writable in some sense. And you can see that when you go to a conference and we put a name tag around your neck. You can see that in the way that people fold over the page when they're reading a book, or they put a bookmark into the book. People write on their hands. They put little messages to themselves. We're very good at making the natural and the physical world sort of writable in some sense, which is to say we put information into places that makes it most useful. And by contrast, what happens a lot in the digital world is that many of the objects that we run into, whether they're web pages or other people's files or other things, and I can give you some more examples, they're not writable in any way. And when you've got more information about one of those things, like a web page that you've read or an EPUB that you may want to comment on or something like that, we're usually forced to put that extra information somewhere else. Because in the digital world, the objects have got owners and they're read-only, or many times you may own the object, but you can't change it because it has a particular format and it's under the control of an application. So even though you may own an HTML file, let's say, or a PDF file or a Microsoft Word document, you can't make arbitrary changes to it. You can only do the things that have been anticipated and that are allowed by the application, which is managing that information for you. So you can't walk up to it and write on it. You can't put a post-it note onto things. You can't do things that haven't been anticipated. And one way of talking about that or summarizing that difference is to say that the physical world and the natural world that we live in is very often writable. We find a way to make it writable in a way that makes it possible for humans to work with information in very natural ways. And the digital world is very often read-only, or you can write, but only when you've got permission to do exactly one of the things that's been anticipated. And so I think a change which is coming and which was really signaled by the arrival of tagging and delicious is that normal people in the future will be able to add content to basically anything. And that can mean books. It might mean URLs in the way of delicious, but it could also mean objects like email addresses or zip codes or basically anything. So I think that the future of the digital world is a writable future, and that we're going to look back at some point, maybe in 2 years, maybe in 5 years, and we're going to think about the web and we'll say, remember those 15 years, when the web was basically read-only and you couldn't write, and we thought the web was incredibly cool. What were we doing then? When we couldn't act like a normal human, and any time we had a bit of interesting information about something, we had to go and put it somewhere else. We couldn't put it with the object. And it's kind of like now, we look back at the period from, let's say, 1990 to 1995, when the web was just getting going, and there were no search engines. And, I don't know if you remember, but, in 1994 or 95 or something like that, we thought the web was incredibly cool, but you couldn't search. But, that was just the way the web was. You went to Yahoo and you looked through the yellow pages that they basically set up there, and you found your stuff, and you said, wow, that's amazing. But you couldn't search. We look back and we say, wow, it was incredibly primitive. I think the same thing is going to happen with digital content. We're going to look back and say, well, you know what? We couldn't write. Every time we had something interesting to say, like, I read that book, or that's cool, or Joe would like that book, or I want to put a comment or an annotation on it, or whatever, we had to put that information somewhere else. That, I think, is going to be a fundamental change in how we work with digital information.
Yeah, and, I want to go back on something you said there because it's near and dear to my heart, and that is, as a user, for example, of a Kindle, I complain a lot about how glacial the pace of change is and the features that are added to the Reader app itself, right? And so for something even as simple as being able to take some notes and immediately share them with a group of friends, or, it took so long for Amazon to even introduce some sort of Twitter functionality to the app, right? And so one of the things I've been suggesting is if Amazon really wanted to increase the speed at which new features are added, they should either consider open sourcing that reader app so that the whole community could contribute, or along the lines of what we're talking about today, maybe create an API set so that extensions to it could be created by third-party developers. Because, again, I think that there are probably features out there that they haven't even considered, but somebody might come up with it, and if they could quickly add to it, it wouldn't come across as just something that's sloppily grafted onto the existing application, right?
Yeah, I think you're right that there's a lot of things that might potentially happen. And that, of course, that's a world where different parties are trying to balance things like control and power and profit and so on. And I think to be a bit more sort of specific about the publishing industry, because I gave you a very high-level answer to the last question, I think what's happened in the publishing industry, one of the big changes is that publishers now recognize that the audience, that there's value in the audience and in the signal that's coming from the audience. And there's a nice expression which I like, which is that I think it was Stuart Brand, but I'm not sure. I should get this right, because whoever said this deserves the credit for it. Who referred to the audience as the former audience, and in that phrase, it's basically saying the people who we used to regard as this sort of passive audience who were consuming information that was being published by the official publisher are now talking amongst each other in ways that they couldn't talk formally. They're tagging things, they're recommending things to each other, they're pulling out quotations, they're doing all sorts of things with the information, and there's value in that signal. And I think it's important to publishers to somehow try and capture that information and to enable the social side of reading, if you like. And I think reading has always been a social activity. There's some reading which has been in isolation, but ever since the rise of the popular book and the novel and so on and so forth, there's really a social side of reading. I mean, even things like page numbers. You can think to yourself, why do page numbers even exist? You don't really need the page numbers if you're just reading the book in isolation, because you can put a bookmark into the book. You don't need a page number. But if you want to communicate with someone and say, hey, you know what, there's a great quote on page 200, you need a page number. And it's like a social mechanism for communicating information about the book. And there's value in the audience, and I think that's something which is being recognized. And you want to be able to put that value somewhere. You don't want to force people to put it somewhere else. If you can stick it on the object, you can search on it, you can combine it, you can augment it, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, you also made the point about how primitive content looked, 15 years ago today. I think that's the same space that we're in right now with ebooks, that in 5 years, hopefully even sooner, we're going to look back and sort of laugh at how quaint it was when we did those quick and dirty conversions of print to e and so forth. But I think opening up applications and content to other developers through APIs, like what you're suggesting, is one way to get there. Because if we rely just on the publisher or just on, in this case, the vendor maybe to do that, we're never going to get there. So, but I want to switch for a second now. And if read-only content is sort of in the past, writable content is I'm sure a new concept to a lot of publishers out there. And one of the potential fears they have, and you mentioned this a moment ago, is the loss of control. So how do you manage that if you're going to open up your content through APIs?
Well, I think you have to have several things in place. When I talk about writable content, I don't really mean that one party could come and overwrite the content of some other party. I really mean that additional information could be put onto the same objects. So you may have an object representing an ebook, and Joe wants to come along and put a rating on that thing or a comment on that thing, but Joe doesn't have permission to go along and change, let's say the O'Reilly EPUB content of the object. So that's the first thing to sort of be clear about with writable. When I talk about writable content, that's sort of an easy way to say something that shouldn't raise fear about people's content being overwritten. then there's some other things you need. You need things like a permission system, of course, to enforce that kind of, rights process where, whereby certain people can do certain things and others can't do other things. You probably want a mechanism for people to be able to charge for access to their tags or their information on the objects. In the Fluidinfo system, we have all of those things. You can put your tags with your namespace and your permissions and so on onto any object. You can protect them, you can search on them, and so on and so forth. So you definitely need those kinds of things. You don't want to have a world which is really like a wiki, because Wikipedia or wikis in general, different users can overwrite each other's content, and you have editing wars. You obviously don't want to have that in the world of ebooks or the world of publishers with very valuable content that they're trying to sell and which has to be reliable and so on and so forth. So that's one way in which Fluidinfo is very different from a wiki. The thing which I think you do want to have, and which is very important, is that the objects involved, and when I say objects, I mean things like ebooks or publications of some form or whatever it turns out to be, those things don't have to have owners. What you can instead do is you can make the pieces have owners. So one piece of an object might be the EPUB content, another piece might be someone else's rating, and those two pieces can have different owners. But the object itself doesn't have an owner. It's more like a concept. Like, for example, O'Reilly has a book called Programming Python, and there's a concept of programming Python in the world, and I could say to you, that's something that I own, it's something that I've read, it's something that I think is pretty good, it's one of those books which has doubled in size over the years, all of that kind of metadata. Why can't I add that to the concept of programming Python? I shouldn't have to ask you, you shouldn't have to anticipate that I might want to go and do that. I don't have to tell you my private opinion of that book. I can if I want, and so on. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from looking at the way we do things in the natural world in those kinds of ways that I just illustrated, and thinking about what would a digital world look like that had those kinds of desirable properties. And the way that you get there, I think the key thing in getting there is to make a storage architecture in which the objects don't have owners. And they're more like concepts, and you let anyone come and put things onto the objects without asking for permission and without trying to anticipate what those future needs might be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So
another answer.
No, it absolutely did. And actually one of those risks, I think, is sort of the financial side of things, right? So how can a publisher avoid the situation where they open their content up through APIs, a developer is able to come in and offer access to third parties at a price lower than maybe what the publisher wants to sell it at, or worse, maybe give it away for free?
Well, I think the terms and conditions of the API have to be clearly stated and so on. There's, if a publisher wants to put all of their information online and to make it free and completely accessible, which does happen in some cases, that's great. If they want to charge access and give you an API key where you pay, let's say, some amount of money every 10,000 accesses or whatever the conditions are, then that's great as well. The point is, I think, to allow it to happen and to see what the possibilities are. Another thing which I think is going to drive some of this sort of change in dynamics, in the dynamics of publishing, is that in the middle of the 90s, there was a huge flight of data, or a migration of data into databases and coming out of the databases and being presented in HTML as web pages. And the web pages were read-only. They're sort of monolithic, big chunks of data, and nobody really figured out how to monetize them. We put ads alongside of these things, and people made money as a side effect of advertising on the content. But that's kind of it's not very interesting in some way. And I think what's happening now is that we're seeing the rise of mobile applications, and there's a lot of people walking around with devices in their pockets that have got a lot of applications on them that are quite vertical, do quite specialized things. And at the same time, you have publishers who are sitting on huge amounts of carefully curated, valuable content that could be made accessible to these mobile devices and the applications on them. But in order to do that, it's not enough to present your content in these big chunks of HTML where an application can, let's say, go to the O'Reilly website and read all the content about the whole book and present some of it on a tiny screen. It's more likely that an application developer might want to use an API, go into the O'Reilly API and say, hey, give me the prices of all the books that have got Python in the title and that are available in Japanese, and I want to see the prices in yen. And just pull out the specific pieces of information that the application needs. And because the mobile ecosystem is very different from the web, and you have people who are actually paying for applications, they're paying 99 cents or $1.99 or whatever for an application, you have money flowing into the ecosystem. Consumers are paying money, application writers they have money coming in, they're able to purchase access to content through APIs. And I think that world is very different from the read-only, monolithic, we don't know how to monetize it world of publishing information through HTML. And a good example of that actually is one that you brought up in an earlier conversation, where you have publishers that have got travel information. And if you look at the market of travel books, the value in the market is going out at a rate of something like 20%, every couple of years. So the value in that market is disappearing very, very rapidly, and people are not traveling with books anymore. They're traveling with iPhones and apps. And on the other hand, the publishers have got all this valuable information. Why not make it so you can get at that information while you're traveling with your iPhone, pull your phone out when you're in a foreign city, find a nearby restaurant that's friendly for kids and has familiar cuisine or whatever it is, and you don't need the book.
Yeah, I think, by the way, I think one of the points that you're making, I just want to underscore it here, is that if a publisher has experimented in the past, let's say with paywall access on their website, and they've failed or had mixed results at best, that they shouldn't automatically assume that they're not going to be successful with a mobile strategy with that same content, right? Because there's, it's been proven that that's a totally different world and a different model, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And the paywalls are in front of those, as I keep on calling them, these sort of big monolithic blobs of HTML. You don't know what it is before you pay for access. You pay for access in some large amount, and you see the HTML page. In the mobile world, it's different because an application developer can look at an API and say, okay, I'm building an application, let's say for travel in London, and O'Reilly's got some great data. Lonely Planet, who's now owned by the BBC, have got some great data. Pearson have got some great data, and so on. And I know what the data is. I know they've got latitude and longitude information on 25,000 restaurants. I know that some other site has got ratings and so on. And it's the application developer who pays for access to the information, and they get their costs back by charging the consumer for the application. So it's quite a different setup.
So, yeah, and we touched on this a moment ago, but, like I said, I think that what we've got today, by and large, is a world where our content, digitally at least, is simply a quick and dirty port from the print version. And I think when we spoke before, we both agreed that that's got to change. I mean, there's always going to be, I think, a market out there for some of that. But I think what a lot of consumers are interested in seeing is how can I fully tap into the power of this iPad or this mobile phone or whatever. And so what do you think publishers need to be doing differently to better leverage and get away from just those quick and dirty conversions?
Well, I think there are many possibilities. And there's a thing about the publishing industry which I think is it's unique in a way, or it's quite special, which I'll talk about second. But first of all, if you have APIs and so on, you can be making mobile applications that are doing basically anything, and you don't have to have these huge chunks of digital information that are basically trying to mirror books, which have been around for centuries and aren't necessarily very relevant to someone walking around with a mobile application, or someone, even a programmer sitting in front of a computer wanting a bit of technical information, which may be relevant to O'Reilly, but maybe not to other publishing companies. So I think there's a lot of flexibility there that you don't have when you're just saying, okay, let's take these old-fashioned objects we've got and make a digital equivalent of them. But the more interesting aspect, which is relevant to the publishing industry, is that I think it's possible for programmers and the applications that they write and so on to build entirely new products that also take the form of being, let's say, an ebook, or they're readable on a Kindle or an Android device or an iPhone or whatever it turns out to be. And it's interesting because it's not really a use of an API necessarily to pull out a little bit of information which is interesting and relevant and to present it in a different way or whatever, but you may be making an entirely different product. And, maybe it's a derivative product that has to be covered under derivative works in terms and conditions and so on. But, just to give you an example, Fluidinfo made a little application where you could do a query into our database and pull out, it's actually a bit wacky, you could pull out different versions of the Bible, and you could make a new version of the Bible and, based on the King James Bible and some other things, and the result of running that query was basically a new book. And then maybe that's not a book that you want to really mess with, but Nicholas Tolliver, who works for Fluidinfo, gave a presentation of this at a London event called Hacking the Book. And so he said, well, let's really hack the book. And he made a new version of the Bible. But, to be a bit more sort of concrete and specific, let's say for O'Reilly, you could imagine that a programmer somewhere, an enterprising programmer, takes the O'Reilly API, takes something like Stack Exchange, or maybe something else as well, and uses it to produce new versions of your books. For example, they could go to Stack Exchange and find the best or the most frequently asked questions, the ones with the highest answered ratings and so on, and they could produce an EPUB which had a whole bunch of extra links or incorporated your errata, and you're basically making a different product, and you're doing it with an API. It's programmatic, it can be updated frequently, and it's not what the publisher set out to build, and they didn't intend to do it, but someone does it using an API. And we saw in the competition the API competition, that people were building interesting things that you didn't anticipate, and that's great. But with publishing, there's also the possibility, like I said, of building entirely new digital products. And of course, O'Reilly probably wants to get compensated for some amount of that content. I want to get compensated perhaps if I've answered a whole bunch of questions on Stack Exchange and they get incorporated into a new product. There's a possibility for me to get paid for that sort of work.
Right. So what about the skeptics out there who are looking at something like HTML5 and saying, hey, that's so powerful and so extensible. Maybe I should really go that route and just expose all my content there and build applications off of that. Why should publishers consider custom APIs as a different solution instead?
Well, I think those are two different approaches. Certainly HTML5 is fantastic. In fact, I saw there was a wonderful presentation at the Tools of Change conference in February in New York, which I think blew away almost everybody in the audience. So HTML5 has amazing capabilities and so on. But it's just it's a delivery mechanism, and it's a good one. APIs, it's like saying, here's a toolbox. Here's a toolbox for all our content. You can do whatever you want. You can build another HTML5 app if you want. You can build something that you run on the command line. You can build something which sends SMS messages to your phone. You can, do basically anything you want. So there are two different mechanisms for getting content out to the world.
Right. Makes sense. Okay. Well, terrific. Terry Jones of Fluidinfo, thanks so much for being part of today's TOC podcast. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I love talking about and thinking about those things. So
Great.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Terry.
Thanks a lot.